Welcome to the Low Carb USA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine.
Hey, so I've got Daniel Schulof here, and he has a really interesting story. He was originally an attorney and has since moved on from there, and it all revolved around trying to make his dog healthy. And it's a fascinating story. And Daniel, welcome. And I think just explain to people your story, how you got into this and what you've learned.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Doug. It's good to be here. So like you were saying, once upon a time, I was an attorney. And like you said, I did leave that career path because of a dog. I got my own dog when I was this single, urbanite, yuppie guy living in the city of Atlanta, circa 2010. And he became the love of my life. He was my best friend. I still have him to this day. I could literally see him right now. And he became a big interest for me when I got him. And one of the things that I became interested in was just giving him something I'm sure resonates with every pet owner, giving him the healthiest life I possibly could. And in connection with that, one of the first things that I came upon were some crazy facts about the commonality and deadliness of obesity among pets in the Western world. And the facts that I read at that point just kind of blew my mind. And here's some of the highlights. One is more than half of the dogs and cats in America today are overweight or obese. So if you just pick a dog at random on the street, the next one that you see, it's more likely than not that it's suffering from that disease. The second is that it's staggeringly bad for them. Like anyone who's listening to this podcast knows that obesity isn't optimal for health. But there's good published research in the veterinary nutrition domain that shows that that just moderate obesity for a dog, so like being a little overweight, maybe something you wouldn't even recognize as overweight, is worse for a dog than a lifetime of smoking is for a human being. It'll shorten their lifespan by more than on a percentage basis than a lifetime of smoking will for a person. And so, I read those facts. They had all kinds of implications for my own dog. And it just kind of blew me away. I just couldn't believe that we were all just doing this to our dogs. We were all just loving them to death, giving them more nutrition than they needed. And so I started going down the rabbit hole about it. And long story short, I spent the next 4 years of my life working on a book that would come to be called Dogs, Dog Food and Dogma. And I published it in 2016. And it's a book about this exploration. I eventually quit my job as an attorney to work on the book full time. And the main theses that the book puts forward are two. And they'll probably sound familiar to anyone listening to this podcast, at least in their human analogs will. The first is that carbohydrate is far worse for dogs and cats as a matter of health than anyone in the veterinary community is currently saying, and as most lay people understand. And the second is that the only reason that the veterinary community and the lay public is not more aware of that reality, that the body of evidence suggesting carbs are bad for dogs and cats is robust and deep. The only reason we don't all know that is because legacy pet food companies who rely really heavily on carbohydrate for their core to their business model are working very hard on a variety of fronts to basically keep that evidence from becoming more clear. So for those folks who don't have the time to sift through a 400-page book with full of academic stuff, I'll give you a quick summary of the main points that are made in the book. There are 4 reasons in my eyes why a dog or a cat owner should view reducing or minimizing their animal's carbohydrate intake as basically the most important nutritional decision you can make for that animal. And they all have a lot of human world analogs. So the first and most glaring one is obesity. Like I said, obesity is a horrible problem in the Western world for dogs and cats. And to my eyes, although this is not a thesis that's been tested very carefully, you would not have an obesity epidemic without the existence of carbohydrate in the diet of dogs and cats. Basically, there is already a robust, meaning like the studies have been done half a dozen times already, a robust body of research showing that calorie for calorie, carbohydrate is far more fattening for dogs and cats than other macronutrients. So these studies are much easier to do in the dog and cat world than in the human world. You can really easily control exactly how many calories these animals eat and how many grams of the various macronutrients over a period of 8 weeks. It's much easier than with people. And so they've done it a bunch of times, and it consistently shows the exact same thing. Carbs make them fatter. Same number, isocaloric studies, same number of calories. Only difference is the amount of carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate-rich animals get far fatter. Second reason you might think about it is for metabolic and hormonal reasons. So diabetes doesn't work exactly the same way in dogs and cats as it does in people, but the metabolism of carbohydrate works exactly the same, which is to say carbohydrate goes down goes in the mouth, goes into the gut, and gets broken down into individual molecules of glucose in connection with digestion. The glucose gets absorbed into the bloodstream. If glucose in the bloodstream reaches too high a level, insulin is needed to help dispose of it and prevent hyperglycemia from coming on. And insulin is secreted by the animal's pancreas, and it drives glucose into the very same places we see in human beings, into the fat tissue, into the skeletal muscle tissue. It's been, again, this is something, if you pick up a veterinary nutrition textbook, and you flip to, an epidemiology textbook, and you flip to the section on hormonal regulation of glucose, it's not controversial at all. The only extent to which it's controversial is when it's linked to treatment of diseases like diabetes, and on that front. To that regard, you won't see it discussed at all. The third reason that a pet owner might consider reducing or minimizing their animal's carbohydrate intake is because you want to help the animal avoid or fight off cancer. In this regard, it's the headline point is that there are not dog or cat studies that show in any kind of conclusive way that reducing carbohydrate intake improves cancer outcomes. They haven't been performed. So the entire case that can be made for it is based on animal models from rodents or anecdotal type stuff that crosses over into the sophisticated anecdotal stuff, if you ask me, and I'll kind of like walk through that. Anyone that is listening to this already knows that the majority of cancers prefer glucose metabolism to kind of fuel their rapid rates of growth. This is the case in dogs and cats as well as it is in human beings, which is to say, if you want your veterinarian to tell you if your dog has cancer, they'll put it in a PET scan the same way they do what you would do with a human being. And that technology functions by basically looking for places in the body where glucose is being metabolized at a more rapid rate. And it obviously is being used to show where the tumors are, and clearly shows the inference that glucose is being used as the primary fuel source. Cancer is hugely, hugely popular as a chronic disease among dogs and cats, far more popular than it is among wild species. And this gets to the kind of the fourth reason why a pet owner might consider doing that, which is to say, at a very general level, it's much more natural for the animal. In connection with writing my book, I spent some time at the Living Amongst the Biologists from the Yellowstone Wolf Project, which is basically like the leading field study of gray wolves in the United States, if not the world. And that's relevant to this discussion because dogs and wolves are so genetically, they're two distinct species, but only kind of. They're so genetically similar that they can, and very often do, breed with each other. So like if you ask a lot of biologists, they'll say the difference between, the line between one species and another species is that the two can't breed together and successfully produce offspring. Dogs and wolves are so similar that they actually do that. In the United States right now, there are at least 250,000 dog-wolf hybrids. They're incredibly similar. Their genetic divergence was something like 10,000 years ago, as opposed to, canine species have been around for 200 million years. So you're talking about 99.9% of their evolution took place, they followed the same track. Those same biologists will tell you that there's kind of one characteristic of the diet of gray wolves that stands out among all the others, which is that the animals consume 0.0% carbohydrate. They literally, when they take down a lot of the prey that they tend to eat, are ungulates. So they're these, large animals like elk and deer that they're ruminants. They ingest grasses and plant matter regularly, and they use this kind of very sophisticated digestive structure to ferment basically all this grass material. And when you come upon a wolf kill that's been around for enough time that the animals have moved on, what the biologist will tell you is you find two things basically there at the lake where once there was a a moose carcass. Now there's just two things. The first is these the unbreakable largest bones of the animals, like the pelvis, stuff that wolves and dogs have really strong jaws, but some bones are just too big. That's still there. And the only other thing, you won't find the hide. They eat the entire hide. They eat the majority of the bones. The only other thing you'll find is a big wad of half-fermented grass material. They literally eat the lining of what's called the rumen. They eat the lining of the digestive cavity, but they leave that stuff. And that I like that as a fact because it really shows the extent to which these animals completely avoid it. And so what do you see when you look at cancer outcomes in gray wolves is that it's conceivably possible for the animals to get cancer. It does happen from time to time, but it is incredibly rare. It's like, there have been animals in the wild tend to have violent lives. They die young. Arguably, they shouldn't get cancer as often. But there have been studies performed in zoo settings as well where you have wolves raised in zoo settings that are fed all meat diets. These animals don't suffer from any kind of violence or resource scarcity, but they don't get cancer. It's something like 1/5 of the rate of dogs and cats in the Western world. And so there's clearly something going on there. You've got the exact same genes, one glaring difference that just happens to be linked through a pretty coherent mechanism to cancer, and it just happens to be the main difference between these two species. And so that's basically the 4 reasons why you'd want to consider feeding an animal less carbohydrate, minimizing his amount of carbohydrate intake.
Yeah, that's fascinating, man. We were talking a little bit before we got started here, and seems like as with the human nutrition, there are extraneous forces at work in terms of the pressures to keep the diet the way it is now. And you were telling me about the pet food manufacturers and stuff like that. Maybe tell us a bit about that.
It's not a pleasant story, to tell you the truth. It's one that makes me feel a certain degree of outrage most of the time. The gist of it is this. Pet food as an industry has been around in the United States since before the beginning of the 20th century. And right from its inception, the majority of the industry is composed of what are called extruded pet food products. So kibble style food, where you scoop it up in a measuring cup and it's little nuggets of food product. Among the reasons that's always been the backbone of the industry are that, one, it's cheap to make, cheap for consumers to buy, and two, it's really shelf stable. You can it's very convenient. It's just like a good product were it nutritious. Unfortunately, though they didn't know it at the time, these what would become titans of industry were setting up their businesses. They didn't know it at the time when they were creating entire businesses built around extruded products. The evidence all came out kind of later. It came out once these companies like Ralston Purina and Hill's Pet Nutrition were massive national companies already. Presently, the U.S. pet food market is $29 billion a year. It is big business. And the conceptual backbone of the industry, every kibble product that is made in the United States today is built around dietary carbohydrate. It's it's, if anyone that's a low carb person that's ever tried to bake a loaf of low carb bread knows that it's a challenging process to make bread without flour, because the starch performs a functional role. You heat it up, it gelatinizes, and it holds the dough together during as it gets warmer, and it performs the same function in making kibble. And so it's always been something that's it's difficult to make a kibble that'll hold together without starch, so they just use starch hugely. And so these companies their entire business is built around it. They literally don't even offer low carbohydrate products. And so as more and more evidence started coming out towards the back end of the 20th century, suggesting that carbohydrate was bad for these animals, rather than just roll over and say, okay, we admit it, we're wrong, but we're going to get it right now, they took the same tack that big tobacco took once upon a time, when the evidence was just coming out linking smoking with cancer, and they tried to push back on it. They just basically tried to keep the evidence down rather than modify their product line. And they've done it to a phenomenally successful degree. There's not nearly as much money in canine and feline nutritional research as there is in human research. Mm-hmm. All of the money comes from industry. And it's to such a degree that they literally own and they own the research labs that put out the vast majority of the peer-reviewed research. Each of the three big legacy pet food companies owns its own institute, employs the veterinary nutritionists. There are fewer than 100 veterinary nutritionists in the United States today. So it's not at all a difficult thing to do for these companies to literally employ every single one. And so that, they're able, obviously, by controlling the facilities, they can control what gets published, what gets funded, and what doesn't. And then what is taught in veterinary schools as well. These same 100 vet nutritionists are the only people out there who have the credentials to teach a course in veterinary nutrition. And so they're the ones that are invariably at the veterinary schools teaching these courses. And it's, you got to ask yourself, if McDonald's was employing all of the folks who were teaching, any one subject to rising students, it's just too Pollyanna-ish to assume that they're going to allow a fair treatment of any of the relevant issues. They're not going to teach anything.
Absolutely. So just to finish off then, you were telling me you've gone ahead and actually developed a pet food product that is not high in carbohydrates. So maybe just, we've already talked about your book, so people can go and look for that. Maybe just give people an idea about what they can look for if they want to try and do better for their pets.
Yeah, absolutely. So published my book in 2016. By the time that I was getting to the early stages of the editing process, it had become clear to me that there was a big gap in the market, the U.S. pet food market, which is to say that I wasn't the only person that thought the theses I put forward in the book are persuasive. There are entire communities of people going to conferences like yours. If you are one of those people, if you believe for one reason or another that carbohydrate's bad for your animal, circa 2016, you had two options. One is you could feed the animal a kibble product, but as low carb as you could find. You could go look around for the lowest carbohydrate kibble you could find. And about the best you can find anywhere in the market is about 30% carbohydrate. Not very low. And it's also really difficult to find. The US pet food regulations, amazingly, don't require manufacturers to tell us how much carbohydrate is in the product. So you look at the labeling on the product and they don't say how much carb is in there. So you have to literally perform a calculation in order to figure it out for yourself. So you could try to do that and find the lowest carb product you could find, but literally the lowest are 30%. Or you could feed your dog a raw ingredient diet, which is there are commercial products. There are obviously ways to make these products using just butcher-bought ingredients. But because they're not extruded, they don't require starch to make them. And so you can feed your animal a product that's composed essentially of raw meat. The difficulty there is that, you can't see either of my dogs right now, but I got two dogs. One is a Rottweiler. The other is a St. Bernard. I have two big adult male dogs. And feeding raw meat to those animals every day becomes not just very inconvenient because you're handling a lot of, the animals consuming raw meat all the time. There's raw meat in the kitchen. It's in the bowl. They're licking things and kids. But it's also just phenomenally expensive. Calorie for calorie, it's 500% more than the fanciest kibble you can find. And so if you're going to do that, it works really well if you've got a small dog. And it's kind of the gold standard. If somebody asking for nutrition advice today, my response is, if budget's not an issue and you can deal with the inconvenience, feeding a commercially prepared, complete and balanced raw diet is the best way to go about it. It's the closest thing to what the dog evolved to eat. But if you've got, for me, with 250 pounds of dog, it's a big deal. I can't afford to do it. I can't afford to spend $40 a day feeding my dogs. And so, I tried to make a product that basically marries the best of both worlds. It's a kibble product, but has the carbohydrate content of a raw diet. And so we do make a product now. Our company is called Keto Natural Pet Foods, and our product line is called Ketona, and it's a kibble but it's less than 5% carbohydrates. So it's like 80% less than the best you're going to find, and it's 90+% less than the vast majority of the products out there. But basically, if you want to just, if you don't like it, don't take my word for that. In order to figure out what the carbohydrate content of any individual product is, you essentially have to just email the manufacturer and they will tell you over a direct communication. But it's not as simple as just flipping over the bag. And I would include.
So they don't have those
nutrition facts,
macro tables on the back like they do.
No, they do. They do. They just don't include carbohydrate. They have a protein line, they have a fat line, they have a moisture line, and they have a few other things.
But just no
carbohydrate.
Huh.
And so it's just like it's pretty glaring omission. But basically, that's the best way to go about doing it, is to just ask directly. They'll tell you. And then, my other point is, don't assume based on the bag art or any of the language that's used on the bag that there's any inference you can make about the carbohydrate content. One thing that I've learned is that price and carbohydrate content are not correlated in the world of pet food. The fancier products are more often very much like the garden variety products. They're just marketed differently. And so you really need to get that raw data from the manufacturer if you want to do right by your animal.
Okay, that was fascinating, man. Thanks, Daniel. And we need to keep this conversation going because it's important. And, people that care about their animals need to hear this. So.
Good. I agree.
Okay.
Nice to talk to you, Doug.
Yeah, you too, man. Thanks again.
Okay.
You've been listening to an episode of the Low Carb USA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/lowcarbusa.